Thank you, Charlotte. It's very good to see everyone, and thank you for joining us. Hopefully, as the title suggests, this is going to be a bit of a deep dive into looking at ways in which we can help generate impact, societal and economic benefit from social science research. But I think rather than us just giving what we hope might be not too partial a view, but certainly promoting a particular perspective, we're really keen to hear from you as to what you think the obstacles and even the objections are for doing this kind of thing. We'll talk a bit about our experience in supporting a number of academics across the UK and actually even overseas as well, in terms of promoting this, but also hopefully give you quite a few case studies, which hopefully will bring things to life. Sally, are you able to put the slides up, please? Thanks. Mm-hmm. So Sally and I from Evidence to Impact, if you go to the first slide, please, Sally. We're actually a social enterprise as a spin out from the universities of Cardiff and Bristol, going back about 12 years ago now, when perhaps this was even sort of newer as an agenda. And at the time, we were set up to help roll out some wonderful research that was done at two universities, which had a very significant impact in reducing the uptake of smoking amongst teenagers. And actually, we were able, over the past 10 years or so, to actually take that research, and it's now benefited a really quite remarkable 160,000 children across the UK, but also in France, Colombia, and in the next year or so, we'll also be working and developing this research in China, the Philippines, and Indonesia. But where we began, really, I think this was very much almost an outsource model. It was to say, well, here's some research. We don't quite know how to generate impact from it, therefore we're going to outsource this to a third party. But I think in much more recent times, that's not the way universities work. It's definitely much more a partnership model, where either universities do it themselves, or if they do need support, it's very much done in partnership with social enterprises and with outside organisations. We see ourselves very much as being the servants of academics. We're not the researchers. It's certainly not for us to say how research should be developed. Clearly, it would be ludicrous if the impact tail wagged the research dog. That's clearly not the way round. It has to be research led. The old idea of kind of curiosity, blue sky driven research, where actually the academics think is the need, is certainly what should be happening. But I think increasingly, because funders require it, and I think also because institutions see the value in it, we're encouraging academics we work with to have impact in mind. So whilst the research should always be primary, having at the back of your mind, what might the impact be if this was to be successful and go through to completion. Next slide, please, Sally. So rather than perhaps as we began with, where we would sort of come in at the end point of the research and either license some IP and take it forward rather independently, increasingly now what we do is to get involved at all stages of the research. It could, of course, be licensing the end point of something to then sustainably help roll it out for delivery in different settings, be that schools, healthcare, or communities. But perhaps also thinking at an early stage about what that might look like. So we produce a number of outline market appraisals or some early stage business plans, just to have a look at perhaps how things might be developed. Increasingly, actually, funding is available when there is what's seen as quote unquote industry partner. So it's somebody not from the university. And so even as a spin out from two universities, we do class as an industry partner. So we can often help co-fund some projects, either with cash or with our own time, we could be listed as a co-investigator. So actually, sources of funding that might not be available just for researchers can be accessed if they're in partnership with a social enterprise or a third party. And also increasingly, we even get involved in some of the research development stage via some secondments or short-term contracts. Next, please, Sally. And so again, what we do, and this is not just an advert for us, but actually you'll find hopefully a number of organisations around the country would do similar things. It can be working at the early stage to perhaps get that first amount of impact funding, or that impact acceleration funding, or some follow-on or some applied research funding, all the way to then perhaps taking the end point of that research, where there is a gap between the end point of the research and the point at which it can be sustainably rolled out to benefit the groups that need it the most. And that could be, refining and updating some intervention materials. It could be doing some more of inquiries into what exactly commissioners or funders of services might like. If you're doing something in a clinical setting or via general practitioners or in schools, it's understanding what their needs, their requirements, that their agendas are, and without compromising the sort of fidelity of the research, perhaps just helping to align it so it's most in sync with what those commissioners and funders require. And then actually there's the ongoing work that's required. Hopefully, interventions that can last for years, if not decades, but they require ongoing training of people, ongoing updating and maintenance of materials, providing a quality assurance framework. So you can say if something's working, 5 or 6 years after the end point of the research trial, you can still draw a very clear path backwards and say, because there's a quality assurance framework in place, we can say with confidence that actually the original trial protocols are still being followed, even in this rollout stage. Next slide, please, Sally. So a few examples of what we've done, and we're going to talk about the first two in a bit more detail later on. But I think what we're keen to perhaps do to begin with, and maybe this is something where you might have a time to just put a few things in the chat, or even come off microphone and say some things, is to look at what perhaps are the firstly the obstacles, or even, if you like, the objections for following this sort of work. What are the obstacles to generating impact from social science research, and what indeed might the objections be if actually you didn't think this was an appropriate thing to be doing. So perhaps just put some of those in the chat if you're able to. We can pick up on some of them. But whilst you're perhaps thinking about that, just a few more things to say. I think we found that there's sort of three approaches that certain universities take. There are occasions where actually, a senior or lead academic does decide that actually, he or she is going to be the one that takes their research and then looks at generating impacts, and perhaps even goes as far as running a project or even a social enterprise alongside their work at the university. That's not desirable. There was a view, I think, amongst a lot of universities that you wouldn't want, for example, potentially a kind of world-class academic to become a kind of mediocre entrepreneur alongside that. But I'm not sure that's the case. I think if someone has the desire and the kind of motivation to do so, it's a perfectly valid approach. And actually, they're capable of working out what support they need, what extra members of the team that they require, and could bring those people in. Secondly, I think there's increasingly a recognition that many early career researchers, that this could be quite a fruitful path for them to take. I mean, realistically, I think we know that for everybody who's perhaps doing a PhD or got an early stage contract within a university, isn't necessarily going to all of them go on to become professors. It's just well, that's just fact. And so many actually find this could be quite a fruitful vocation for them to perhaps sort of either have one foot in or one foot outside the university, or if actually they do go on to develop a career in a kind of charitable or social enterprise setting, actually having that academic background, that kind of rigor, analytical understanding, able to really understand what an evidence base is, but then be kind of quite creative, entrepreneurial, really could be quite an exciting possibility for them. So perhaps we could talk a bit more about that. But I think then the third approach, which I think we also find is really productive, is where I think the university and perhaps the lead academics take a kind of governance or strategic oversight view. So again, they may be bringing in a third party. They could be licensing some IP to a third party social enterprise. But actually through the university, through the IP contract, through other legal agreements, still retain control, perhaps chairing the overall project board. So actually still making sure that the intervention, which is based upon their research, they still have control over, but perhaps the day-to-day operating or the day-to-day rollout or maintenance is done by perhaps those who are more equipped to do so. So that's just a few early thoughts. Hopefully now that I saw a few things going in the chat, Charlotte, Lorna, could you perhaps sort of summarise what the comments are? Just go back side before we put up our thoughts.
Sure. I think people are really commenting on the challenges at the moment. And obviously a lot of that focus on capacity, and you've been talking about ways in which different models can help to alleviate the pressure on the academic, for example. Claire said having the time and resources, both staffing and funds, to do the work on creating impact after the grant has finished. Tamsin mentions time capacity. And the difference of skills, especially for taking things into commercial space. Researchers' priorities might be their research rather than entrepreneurship. Talking about being a great researcher, but being an average entrepreneur. I mentioned that it's just not on people's radar as a way of working, and particularly as a way of working. So commercialization is a way of working towards impact and greater social value from your research. I think we're trying to alter the narrative around that through the events that we're putting on. I was going to ask, but you were talking about licensing work, but I suppose bringing the conversation right back to how do I even start to think my work might be appropriate to that? I'm not sure if that's something we'll move on to, but I feel as though as an end goal, it seems very far away from most people. Yes,
I think we yes, and Tamsin agrees with you. That's a great question. We'll definitely come to that, Lorna. Actually, it's probably the sort of next question. So maybe Sally, you could just flick up to some of the thoughts we prepared earlier. I think possibly the first one is a slightly macro issue. I'm slightly conscious that probably the majority of our experience has been working with social scientists who broadly worked in kind of public health, reducing inequality, social prescribing areas where, generally speaking, if there is funding to deliver these programs in across the country, that they're generally through contracts with commissioners, and therefore so cuts to those overall budgets is an obstacle. I think the second point, which I think a number of the comments sort of referred to this, is it could appear a negative, which is, well, academics lack the capacity, they've got so much else on, they don't necessarily have the kind of confidence or the experience. I think that that can be turned to a positive, which is actually, I think this is where the partnership approach is appropriate. I don't want to kind of again imply you can have your cake and eat it, because I think people are naive enough to obviously that it's more complicated than that. But I think an approach where actually you say, what does the academic need to do? I think the minimum is to retain sufficient interest that they're prepared to take a kind of governance steering approach, which literally could be a case of 2 or 3 meetings a year just to kind of oversee and steer. But underpinning that, there may be an IP contract, or even if that's not necessarily tangible intellectual properties, there's still a kind of service level agreement or a memorandum of understanding with a project group or board, where you're confident that there is a clear approach being taken, but you don't have to do the day-to-day work of recruiting people, training them up, developing new materials, perhaps actually delivering work in different settings. That I think is something that there are an awful lot of models around the country that could be looked at. I think it's the difficulty in accessing follow-on funding and impact funding is important, but that's why I think this idea of having the impact in mind at the very least at the beginning, so you're not closing the possibility of applying for that impact funding. Increasingly, Laura and Charles, I'm sure some research councils or funders are even ring fencing some follow-on impact funding for specific institutions. So whilst it's competitive within University of Sussex, University of Edinburgh, University of Bristol, wherever it might be, at least you're kind of competing just within the institution, and you do know that there is a tangible amount of follow-on impact funding available to you, rather than it being, say, a national competitive process. And again, talking to the partners, we could be one, but there's plenty of other organisations that do a similar role. Even if they don't necessarily bring cash, they may well be, as part of that thing, contributing a significant amount of in-kind funding through time or capacity or other resources. And again, I've in a previous role, I worked at the University of Bristol within the research and enterprise development teams. And when I began, this was 2004. Essentially this agenda was all about high tech, high growth. It was about medical devices. It's about drug discovery. It was about sort of high end engineering stuff. And if you're a social scientist, well, you probably didn't have any sort of inclination to talk to people within the broad knowledge transfer teams, but that's changed. And actually, when you've had the potential to generate, ref case studies, having a track record of impact can actually lead to further research funding. So actually, you get more research funding because you have a track record of getting impact from previous work. I think now you're finding the sort of knowledge exchange teams are really focused on social science and indeed humanities research development. So is there a follow-on question to that, Lorna? So I can...
only Paul, that if as it becomes relevant, because you mentioned memorandum of understanding, impact contract, and just to I think I can assume that people know those terms, but perhaps as understanding when those come into play and how they apply to their work maybe less.
Yeah. Sorry, thank you for that. That's good clarification. I suppose what I was trying to say is, sometimes you can think, well, developing or the word spin out can appear very daunting. The implication is, well, either I have to set up a whole new organization or even a company, or if I generate some intellectual property, this will involve a complex, licensing to a third party. Again, sounds very, very sort of complicated. Actually, I think there are easier ways to do it. That there are, you can set up a project which doesn't necessarily have to have a separate legal entity. It can simply be a project with clearly defined terms. So a memorandum of understanding is probably something where, if actually you're working with trusted partners, you like working with them, it doesn't have the full force of a legal agreement. It could just simply be, real clarity of understanding, which may have some sort of legal underpinning if the contracts team or the knowledge transfer team at university help with that. But it's perhaps a sort of a baby step before maybe a fully fledged spin out or a license. Because actually, I think, getting started, that those first steps, could often go quite a long way, rather than thinking it's a binary approach to either doing it all myself within the department or entirely spinning it out to a third party. I think there are steps in between. So perhaps just to move on again, if the next slide, please, Sally. This perhaps, we prepared this in advance, but maybe this is sort of to your point a bit, your previous question, Laura. I think, want to be absolutely clear, the idea that lots of research, the end point would be publication, wider dissemination, making it freely available is absolutely valid. Of course it is. I mean, it's been the bedrock of academic research for a long time. I think most of us instinctively feel that if research is publicly funded, you want to make it as freely available as possible so people benefit from it. So we're certainly not suggesting that the traditional approach of publication dissemination should not be something that continues. But perhaps, and this may be again depending on the nature of the research, I wonder if people could perhaps think of what the limitations to that approach, or that solely that approach, might be, and then again we'll perhaps come up with some of our own suggestions. That might take a little bit more time to think about, but yeah, please do. Again, if you're able to, be grateful to put some comments in the chat or come off mute and say something.
Hi there. I can help get you started if you like. I think one of the things, maybe it just sort of seems obvious, is that it's all very well publishing a paper, but they're for an academic audience. So if you're looking for someone to pick up your paper and go, well, right, I'm going to employ that methodology in my setting, there's a whole lot of translation that needs to happen that be very difficult for people just to do without actually engaging with you as a researcher somehow, so which is obviously a lot of what we try to set up in terms of translational research. That's just my opinion.
I agree entirely. I think that's really well put as well. Yeah, thank you ever so much. That's really helpful. So I should apologise. I'm actually viewing things on my phone with my main laptop open. I didn't actually sort of catch everyone's names. Apologies if I'm not referring to you by name. I'm not getting people's names on my screen. But thank you for that comment. Anyone else or any other comments, Lorna, we've had in the chat?
Yes, Tamsin says the same, that accessing the right audiences and about translation needed between research findings to be able to create impact. And I was just writing a comment myself about when you think about publication and dissemination, it's as if it's a linear process, and you're in contact with people who might be interested or benefit from the research at the end. And obviously, as we know, if you want it to have an effect, you need to talk to them through the process.
Yeah, I saw Tamsin's comment just flash up there about, you know, potentially danger of being an echo chamber. I think it's a really good comment. So Sally, perhaps you could flick up the next slide, and of course I'll be coming to you after that, Sally, for some case studies. I mean, again, you know, I'm not an academic, so I apologise if some of my phrases isn't quite sort of what you'd expect, but you know, to my mind, absolutely that there are areas where, if you're perhaps your research is looking to guide policy, you know, publication dissemination may well be the best approach. You know, things where you're looking for a kind of clear improvements or you know, an endorsement or an enhancement to existing policy, again, wide publication dissemination may be the best thing or best practice. But very often where we particularly we have found, you know, really fruitful areas of endeavour is where actually there is an evidence base that something could be a successful intervention. You know, that there could be an outcome in terms of, let's say, an improvement in health, or in our case, we do a lot on reducing smoking or reducing harmful drinking or other areas of public health, where actually for this to be adopted, there needs to be something done to literally roll it out. I've used the phrase before where there's perhaps a misconception that by making something freely available, you're leaving it on the shelf for anyone to pick up. But actually, rather than being an off-the-shelf product, it ends up just withering on the vine, because actually that there's no incentive or reason to pick it up off the shelf. But that also doesn't mean, you know, therefore it's all about charging lots of money and making lots of money. We like to always use the phrase that this is a cost recovery approach. And so if we talk to a commissioner who might say, well, you know, this is a great evidence base, an outcome from publicly funded research, why are you now proposing to charge us a fee to deliver this or to have access to this research? We would say, well, actually, this is a cost recovery model because we need to recruit and train new people. We need to train them up. We might need a set up the trainer model, where actually you train somebody who then trains people on an ongoing basis. There may need to be updates to materials, you know, to maintain the cost of a website or on maintenance of materials. If actually you're buying this because there is a very good evidence base underpinning it, well, actually you want us to have a quality assurance program where we can reassure you that actually it's being faithfully maintained, that there's a cost to that. So hopefully, you know, that won't lead to be a very, very high cost, but you can see why that there may need to be people whose capacity and time is invested in that, and there would be a cost to the end user. Anyway, we can hopefully discuss that further in more depth. But what I thought might be useful now, and partly so you'd have to hear more from me at this stage, is to hand it to my colleague Sally to give you a couple of case studies, which actually we're actively working on at the moment in partnership with 2 universities. But hopefully you'll kind of see the reasons why we think this approach has been a valid one, and perhaps why actually, had it simply been a publication and dissemination approach, they perhaps wouldn't have had the wider benefit on the lives, in this case, particularly of children that they have. So Sally, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. I just wanted to add as well to what Paul was saying, because I do a lot of the operational stuff and the stuff with customers, if you like. What we know is that if something was made freely available, because our customers are local authorities whose, as you know, their budgets have been stripped for years and years and years, there would be elements of our interventions that they would do differently if it wasn't being quality assured, just to save money. So they'd be doing it for a good reason, but for us and for the academic, there'd be a reputational risk to that, because fundamentally, we only know that this research is effective if it's then replicated in local authorities. So you can't suddenly remove the expensive bits and hope to get the same results. So I think our role is large in protecting that, and I think that's part of what researchers like. They know that that's being done as it was intended. Okay, so case study 1, Programme A. I know Paul alluded to earlier our flagship program that the company was founded on, called Assist, a Stop Smoking in Schools trial. I think one of the things I always try to get across in these webinars or events is, the 2 lead academics on Assist, they were just, and I'm not downselling it, just doing a smoking prevention program. That was the purpose of their work, was to hopefully find some evidence that this approach was successful, which it was. So that was published in the Lancet in 2008. But since then, and as you know from what Paul said, Assist has been to Colombia and Bogota and France, but it's also spurned many further research projects. So before I talk about Programme A, in Bristol, there's Plan A. Plan A is looking at girls and physical activity using the same methodology. Stash at the University of Glasgow is looking at the same model, the Assist model, with older children looking at sexual health and how to use a peer-to-peer model to increase the number of youngsters practicing safe sex. So Programme A is another iteration of the Assist model, again, taking it further. So Programme A, preventing gambling-related harm in adolescents. So unlike Assist, which was very much about preventing smoking, stopping smoking, this is about reducing harm, as it says there. So we work with Edinburgh on that, bringing our insight from the Assist model and the various iterations of that to this new programme. Independently funded prevention programme. Prevention is a big part of what we do to protect young people and their social networks from immediate and future gambling-related harm. It's interesting with Programme A, one of the weaknesses in Assist was that it didn't have a social networking model, so it only looked at conversations within the year of the children who took part. So this version, Programme A with gambling, now looks at these conversations that young people have with their friends across a school, with their families, with people in the community, at youth club. That's something we always wanted Assist to do, and it's now being built into this model. You'll see there, a child or young person is 6 times more likely to gamble if they have a close friend or carer that gambles. It's an absolutely fascinating project as someone who, chucks a quid on the lottery every so often, to actually find out what goes on in the world of gambling has been a massive insight. So Programme A then, whistle stop. So it's an intervention where it takes place in 1 year group. The students are nominating their friends who they think are influential, who they look up to, who they trust and respect. It's really important in this peer nomination process that they don't actually know that they're looking at a gambling intervention, because we want people to nominate their peers based on whether they look up to them, not whether or not they gamble or they think they gamble or do gaming. So the whole year group is surveyed. The top 18% is recruited. They come to a recruitment meeting, that's part 2. 18% because 15% was the critical mass required to disseminate those messages, so 18% just allows for some fallout on that. They're then taken off the school premises for 2 days of really intensive training with trainers, not teachers, because we don't want that backstory that they already have with some of the teachers in their school. And then they're supported and followed up over 4 follow-up sessions when they're back in school after the intervention, after the training. Paul, do you want to add anything to that? Sorry, I'm conscious I'm just whizzing through.
No, carry on. No, carry on.
Okay. So Programme A, we've just completed the feasibility and the bid is just going in for the next stage of that programme. What's really interesting for us as well is things like social network analysis. That's an addition to the original research. We feed back to other universities who are carrying out research using that model. So it's become a bit of a network, really. So Intent's lovely. Intent's our current, very recently launched smoking prevention programme, which we came across in 2018. I think that's important because as someone, when I came to this sort of in 2010, it just felt like research took such a long time to the layperson. You know, what do you mean 4 years, 5 years, 6 years, 7 years? So we met the academics for Intent in 2018 when it had just been published. And bearing in mind, we've had lockdown and we've had everything kind of grinding to a halt. We were ready to launch it probably nearly a year ago now, but we launched it at the start of the year. And that is a really quick turnaround. If we hadn't had lockdown, we could have probably gone from initial meeting with the academic to having this in the public space as a program you can license within 12 months. So, you know, what can feel quite intimidating needn't be a long drawn out process. So a University of Leeds program, smoking prevention, based on implementation intentions and based in schools. What was important to us in deciding, I know Lorna, you raised the question earlier, how do I know if my research will have a market? How do I know what the impact could be or whether it's worth, you know, how do you even think about that? For us, and partly because we have expertise in the area of smoking prevention, we knew what the barriers to uptake were in local authorities and in schools in terms of cost, in terms of the time that needed to be allocated. So with assist 2 full days out of school training, that would be unlikely to happen now with the COVID recovery that's going on in schools and trying to narrow the attainment gap. So this is a really quick, simple, extremely affordable program. I'm not sure if you know what if-then plans are, but it's like if you want to go to the gym regularly, and if you write it down, you're more likely to go. So it's looking at what do you want to achieve and how are you going to get there? And an if-then plan is the bit in the middle that almost removes your need for willpower to get off the sofa and go to the gym. It's that automatic response, you know. I'm not very good at that, but
well, just to add to that, I think what the academics found, bearing in mind these are year 7, 8, 9, 10 kids. So in some cases they're not even teenagers; they're sort of early, very early in their school career. They would say, you know, if I'm offered a cigarette, then I'll do this, or actually if I'm tempted to go to a party where I know they're smoking, you know, I may have a plan in place where I go with other friends, and so we'll stick together and not smoke. Or actually, if I'm offered a cigarette because I know that, you know, my auntie perhaps sadly died of you know, smoking related illnesses, you know, I've got the motivation not to go down that path or not to waste my money on it. And I think as time goes on, because this is a sort of a short and sharp intervention delivered over the course of 4 years, just 2 sessions in each academic year, but you kind of regularly go back to it every 6 months effectively. We hope that the children's plans will go from being kind of off the shelf to bespoke. So inevitably the year 7s may end up picking from a kind of, you know, drop down menu and probably pick an if-then plan, which is probably close to what they want to do. But by the end, they're developing quite sophisticated, almost resilient strategies, which again, the evidence shows, you know, is far more effective than simply reacting at the time when, you know, you could be tempted or you're feeling under quite a lot of peer pressure.
Thank you, Paul. So yeah, so as Paul said, it covers 4 year groups. That's increased its appeal massively. You know, we know that that's what local authorities want. They want a business as usual type program, not a 1 year hit. 2 sessions per year, short sessions, so not a big commitment from schools. We've cross-reference the materials to it's now called the RPHE curriculum. So we're not saying to teachers, can you do this in addition to what you already do? We're saying we're providing you with 8 high-quality lessons that build on each other incrementally, that cover off the objectives that you have to meet anyway. So it's finding those ways of removing the barriers. Everything they need to deliver it is provided, and it's via the interactive whiteboard. That's how they work anyway, you know. And also for us, working in a public health arena, as you can appreciate, especially with things like smoking and drinking, legislation changes quite often. So if you've got an intervention that can be largely electronic, it's much easier to keep pace with change. When we talked earlier about a cost recovery model, you know, there's a website that goes with this program. So this is where teachers and local authorities can go. They can look at the research. They've got tons and tons of information. And also you can see on the top right, the resources login. So that's where everything is housed that enables the program to be delivered by teachers. It's all there. So what we know is students who participate in the program are 25.6% less likely to take up smoking, and they're also less likely to vape. And that's something, even since this research was published, it's massive. We're building in content on vaping to bring it up to date. And then, so it's a 4-year license, provides training, materials, quality assurance, customer area, and a help desk. So those are the sorts of things that you could build in. And there's a resources area for teachers. So I think, go on, Paul.
Well, no, sorry, you carry on, I'll...
So I think it's a really good example of how you can take one idea, one bit of your research, and how even when it's finished, it can be replicated and developed and enhanced and improved. And Assist Global, where we are going into China and Indonesia and the Philippines, again, that's another opportunity to update, to look at online resources, to look at adaptation. So it doesn't have to end with a final paper, I guess is what I'm saying. Sorry, Paul.
No, I was going to say, just trying to give colleagues on the call just that the idea of what this will be like from the academics perspective. So Intent was developed by a professor at the University of Leeds. And actually with the research, there was obviously funding available to the schools in the trial who were paid to actually be part of this trial. And of course, his assumption was, well, if at the end of the trial, if you then ask the schools to pay for it, that they're going to say no. So really, our role was partly to find, an appropriate route to market, which is actually saying, no, it has to be freely available to the schools. But you go to local authorities who have a responsibility for public health. They probably have tobacco control teams, even if they're woefully underfunded, they still probably do have them, rather than just doing adult cessation programs, i.e. help to stop adults from smoking. They also have responsibility to try and prevent young people smoking in the first place. So actually the materials that he did were fine for the trial, but hopefully just a brief glimpse at the resources on the screen in front of you, you can tell these are a bit slightly more modern. They're professionally produced by a graphic designer. So they're probably what you would need to have for a product which you're actually developing and rolling out. So we did all that. We helped do the translation of the trial materials into the curriculum guide. We helped map it to the school existing curriculum guide, even giving them in the customer area, sample letters to write to head teachers, how you might go ahead and train people. We produce the training for teachers online, all of which actually the academic has not had to do any of it at all. And yet he still sits chairing the project board, steering us. If there's areas where we may say, actually, can we do this? He'll say, well, no, you can't do that because actually the research was predicated on this basis. So we can't do that, but you can do this. We still effectively report to him because it's his intervention. So he understands the extent to which it's being rolled out. Although it's a cost recovery model, we do pay a modest license to Leeds. Not going to be very much money, but there's still a little bit that goes back into the research. And perhaps crucially, although this is still to be, still to discover whether we'll be successful or not, but we've applied to some particular funding to adapt the intent model on a trial to actually also address harmful drinking and drug behaviour. So again, from the researcher's basis, his work in smoking is now potentially, because of the impact it's already creating, makes it more likely that a subsequent bid to extend this to to alcohol and drugs may be successful. So I raised some questions coming in. Lorna,
shall I take Lorna's question?
Please, yeah.
There's a loop back in terms of, for us, this is the first year of this intervention being delivered in the real world. So we call it an implementation year. Yep. And during this year, we're collecting lots of insight and feedback. We're actually reflecting and reviewing the materials, and also involving the academic in that, because there will be things that crop up, when it's a paid for product that we'll need his input on, can we do this differently or whatever. We also collect data from customers and down to individual school and year group level, because even though at the moment our academic on this is quite relaxed, we know we'd rather have all of this stuff up front, so that if the university then decide they want to start to compile a ref case study from it, we've collected the data, we know the reach. So we measure stuff like that. We're doing surveys at the moment with teachers and local authorities. We can do more of that if that's what the academic wants. It's definitely a partnership. It's not something that, we work together on how the academic wants to be involved.
And actually, just to add to that, because it's a quite important point. As with most cases, the outputs of any intervention, really only one party can claim them. Actually, we don't need to claim them, because we're hopefully sustainable on that cost recovery model. So as Sally says, we actually collate the data and the outputs and the impact, but it's still the university's impact. They created it. So it's not as if we take those outputs and then we go and get funding for ourselves. No, we collate it for the academics and say, you now have generated this impact, and if you go ahead and get a ref case study or you apply for other research funding, that's all for your benefit. I think that's the only really appropriate way of doing it.
Do you want to take Saskia's question, Paul? The next one down.
Yeah, again, sorry, would you mind just read that out? Because I'm working off two screens. I do beg your pardon.
It's about how do researchers fund engaging organisations like ours to get things off the ground, to get that first iteration done of maybe what the next steps are, or even packaging and disseminating an intervention.
Yeah, well, I think that there's two ways of doing it. I mean, I think, as I mentioned before, some of this impact acceleration funding, which hopefully in some cases is ring fenced within the university, so there's access to it, albeit on a competitive basis. There is some sort of follow-on funding. In some cases, I'm thinking of work we did with UCL, where actually they wrote into their RCT bid a small amount of money for us to do some of this work. So even though it was potentially at risk, because if the trial was not found to be statistically significant, you could argue that the money would therefore not be used, given the amount that was spent for us to develop a business plan and the market appraisal and do lots of talking to commissioners and GPs, etc. in advance. It was a fraction of what they were spending on the overall trial. So the Research Council basically said, well, given we're choosing to invest this amount of money in the overall research, a fraction of that to have that impact in mind, to use that phrase again, was deemed to be a sensible use of money. And in some cases, I think particularly with intent, as you know, Sally, because we really felt there was a clear route to market, and we were confident that we could do that cost recovery. We could actually get some licensed sales to local authorities. not only did we get a bit of money from the university impact fund, but actually we put in quite a lot of our own time and resource, effectively at the risk that we might be able to get it back in the future. And again, there's other parts that do that. We've also applied to charitable trusts, so there's non-research funding, because I think in lots of cases, if you look at the sort of totality of so non-research but still philanthropic or charitable trust or family trust money, actually they don't tend to get a lot of ideas for social enterprise ventures that do have the evidence base that ideas that were based on academic research have. So I'm not saying it's easy, but I think for the right ideas, particularly ones that are well articulated and are clear what the outcomes they want to deliver might be, that I think there is funding out there.
Yeah, and we've just put in a bid with Cardiff right up to the deadline of the last IAA cycle on it, to work on a pilot with them on something to do with training social workers. And that was something where we knew there was an appetite for it, because the academic could evidence that people were interested in this research if they could, if it was turned into a training program or something they could do. So he felt that it was very likely to be funded, and that within that pot there was money available for it. So I think it's also knowing within your school or your university where these little pots of money are, and can you, how can they benefit what you're doing? It's not always a straight line between the pot and your research. There might be another hook to get that money. Okay, conscious of
just one more quick example. Again, hopefully it's irrelevant. We did some work with some researchers who developed an app, a kind of mobile health app, or to really help people who drink alcohol to excess to actually reduce the amounts of alcohol they drink. And actually, it's very, very widely used already. This is probably an example where, through this quite significant research group at the university, it's likely that this app, if the trial is further successful, will kind of roll out and develop, within the department still. But where they had a gap was really understanding how, GPs in particular might refer patients to this. And so we had a relatively simple task. We did more work for them on modelling, but one particular task we did was actually just to have conversations with GPs where we were saying to them, tell us what we don't know that we don't know. Don't tell us why this is great, because if you basically say, well, we've got an evidence base that might reduce problem drinking, everyone's going to say wonderful, fantastic, excellent. But tell us the obstacles, the reasons why, this might, again, wither on the vine, or you might not have the time or capacity to do it. And there just lots of conversations where they were really saying, well, probably this is going to be, we may have this in the context of a conversation about mental health, for example, or it may be when we screen patients who are new to the surgery, particularly in, say, urban areas with quite a high turnover of patients. It may be patients who are above the age of 40, or they may have a certain, weight level which may cause us concern, or they may be, pre-diabetic. We could add on these conversations around alcohol in these conversations, or it could be, when we do health checks for certain patients. So, there's lots more to this, but we were finding very, very clear kind of avenues into GP. So rather than simply saying, here's a great app, we expect everyone will just use it, and then be wondering why no one picks it up. Understanding, the time constraints, the resource constraints, exactly how GPs interact with their patient at quite a granular level. We were then able to give very specific recommendations about how this, well, hopefully will be a really, really welcome app, would really be front of mind for GPs. So they will be consistently recommending it as what probably will end up being a free to download or $1.99 download, so essentially free app to use. So again, that's an example of researchers finding what was their gap, where did they need the outside help, and again, there are people, including us, who can help with that. So just before perhaps we just turn to sort of, I guess, our sort of summary learning points, I mean, do you want to have any further comments, or I'm happy to answer questions, but equally kind of keen to hear from you as well. That doesn't have to be a question, just give us your own thoughts on this before we perhaps go to some sort of summary points to conclude. Well, Lorna, did you have any further questions, or should we go through these ones here and then?
I think it's gone up in the chat. It would be really great to hear from other people, and not just me. I suppose I've got more questions, and I think perhaps if we go through your summary learning points, I'd really like to hear more about the practical nitty-gritty of the different ways in which you've become involved in projects, sure. Thinking about our audience and how they might be thinking about developing their work, or thinking about how they can support people to do that, and where they might need to involve others, etc. It'd just be really good to break that down further, but I think maybe if we come to that in questions. Sure,
okay. So just the last couple of slides then. I mean, I hope we haven't sort of fallen between two or three stools here. I mean, in one sense, we're trying to speak both to the senior academics, the early career researchers, and those who support but both of those groups. So, but I think these are probably the kind of bits that are relevant to all three parties, if you like. I think that most people I think would clearly accept that the aim is to maximise the impact of publicly funded research, and actually we do clearly think that the traditional way of making it freely available or publication or dissemination is a perfectly valid model, but I think where in particular there is that gap, and that's the key thing between the endpoints of the research and the point at which it can then be sustainably rolled out, there is then the need for some kind of intervention. I think a social enterprise cost recovery model, I think, is the most appropriate, and that probably does differ from the licensing for-profit, probably higher cost of financial return barrier that maybe the same institutions would be expecting for, say, their engineering ICT or medical IP. This is partly because it's not just maximise the impact of the research that was probably funded by the taxpayer, but actually if you can roll this out. So in our case, reducing harmful drinking, preventing teenagers smoking in the first place, significantly reducing the harm of perhaps risky sexual behaviour or gambling or drugs, there are very, very significant savings to taxpayer as well. And so then thinking about that, the old double or triple bottom line, even if something is cost recovery on a straight P&L basis, profit and loss basis, if you factor in the savings to the state, these really can be hugely impactful and significant ventures. And the final slide, please, Sally. Can you do one more? Yeah, thank you. So finally, what we would say is, one up. Sorry, that's it. Thank you. Absolutely passionate that academics really should focus on what they do best. It's not just their capabilities, but also the motivation. If you're motivated and impassioned by this agenda, then I really think you probably are the best person to take this forward. But equally, if actually deep down you're concerned about your capacity, your resource, your other priorities, then I really think the partnership approach is the best way. And then take that governance role, that overall sort of steering role, which I think is the best one. I think for graduates or early career researchers, there is the chance to do both. So we can perhaps do a bit more of a deep dive if examples you wanted us to look at, or again, we gladly for free, I mean, genuinely mean this, we're very happy to have a one-to-one call with any early career researchers who simply wants to have a chat about their particular research, we'd be very happy to do that just on a pro bono basis. I think because this agenda is growing, therefore that hopefully the quality and the quantity of potential partners is growing. So you really should sort of shop around and try and look for those that are available. And then again, maybe the final point, what's really the core business of the university. I am convinced, having seen this happen on multiple institutions, that you are more likely to get further research funding if you've already demonstrated impact from previous research. And then ultimately there can be ref case studies, which of course can enhance the institution from a reputational and a funding perspective. So that's probably our kind of key summary points. But again, in the time we've got available, very happy to hear from you on challenges or add to what we said, or any further questions. We'd be happy to try and answer them if we can.
There's a question in the chat from Saskia, which is to ask, do you work outside of health and social care? And she says she can see implementation science in that area takes particular directions, but also seems really applicable to other sectors too.
Yeah, I think if you sort of drew a Venn diagram of what we do, the overlapping thing, probably our sweet spot is work with schools and probably on sort of preventing, negative health outcomes, inequality. But more widely than that, I think we then tend to sort of the wider bits of the Venn diagram, if you like, would be other kind of clinical health settings. But actually, I think probably overall we're getting quite good to sort of perhaps helping academics think a little bit laterally about how social science research, where often for obvious reasons, I mean, that there isn't the obvious, there's a clear payback. If actually you're generating something where there's an obvious commercial route to market, you can, make some money for the institution or for the department. You should do that. I mean, you clearly should do. But I think if there was obvious routes, well, it had already been done. So I think where we tend to help people is, well, there's not an obvious commercial route. It's probably going to require some further philanthropic impact stuff. You're probably going to have to make the business case from the social return, not the financial return. Can we help you think a little bit laterally? Can we help you to package this up? And again, another example, again, it's a schools one, but it's not health related one. We supported some academics who'd done really excellent work on restorative justice, where again, they'd been funded, and therefore the schools had been funded to do to use restorative justice practices in schools where there was conflict between teachers and pupils or between pupils. And there were some wonderful outcomes coming out of that. But again, when you get back to the point, you say, well, now the research is over, will the schools now pay for what they perhaps already had for free? Again, surprise, surprise, the answer was no, don't have the budget, etc. But one of the ways we've advised them to look at repackaging this is you talk to schools, and where it really does cost them money, actual cash, and also Ofsted, which of course Ofsted tends to really have a very dominant role over schools, is in reducing fixed term exclusions, where often in particular, it's the most disadvantaged pupils who are more at risk of fixed term exclusions. And kind of, as it were, buried within the data, there was some really helpful impact on reducing fixed term exclusions. So actually now you can talk to the councils who run pupil referral units, where if schools exclude kids either on a temporary or permanent basis, those councils are now spending huge amounts of money running pupil referral units, which to basically house and educate these kids whilst they're between schools or temporarily excluded. And if you can actually reduce the cost of that, then suddenly it can come out of the school's budget. And so the same intervention, which had all those wonderful outcomes, you've now helped them package it in a way where, faithful to the original research, there's now a market, if you like, for even if, again, a cost recovery, but you can now say the savings you will make will be far greater than the cost of implementing this intervention. So it's not easy. It really isn't easy. Still doesn't mean that you can offer people a no-brainer and they'll still turn it down. But even in the worst case scenario, it doesn't get widely adopted. As an institution or as an academic, you can still take these, market appraisals, these business plans, these clear marketing approaches. So we tried our very, very best. And even then, if it's left on the shelf, quote unquote, to be taken up by anybody, rather than simply making the research outcomes freely available, you now may say, look, here's our business plan. We couldn't actually get this adopted, but you are now free to take our fully costed business plan with great materials. And actually, if you can make this work, then actually we'd be glad for you to have that, because again, we can still show the impact at a later date. So again, you've helped bridge that gap between the end point of the research and the point at which it could be rolled out. And that may even end up being the only thing you do, but that will still be a very good thing to do.
I think as well, Paul, I was just replying to that question actually, so you saved me some work. I think what I would say to that is we do specialise in health and social care in schools, but we're always open to suggestions, or we often have initial chats with people, with academics, but we don't take things forward that we don't feel we can add value to. We're always happy to try and signpost people on to maybe someone else who can help. We just like exploring, I suppose, new landscapes really for us. So I think it's never say never, really.
Yeah.
Okay.
Does anyone else have a question? I've got more questions I can put to you, but it'd be good to make sure that other people's questions are taken first. No, I did wonder. So I was asking about perhaps breaking it down into the, if we have people who are supporting or doing this work themselves, what you help people with chunks of work, and I suppose I wondered what those might look like. You were talking about that might be a package of developing training materials and standalone project, market research, or commissioning pathways. I wasn't totally sure about which commissioning pathway was, but just wondering about the I suppose the chronology that you tend to find in these projects, if there is anything standard. What point people come to you, or the order that these things happen in, but also wondering about additional funding is often needed because these things are not going to go to market quickly. ESRC IEA can be a source of funding potentially to kick things off, but do you go out for other funding as part of the process toward of moving towards a venture that sustains itself? Lots of questions wrapped up in that, sorry.
So would you mind starting with that? I'm afraid I temporarily lost the question, so I didn't hear all of it.
Sorry, Paul. It was a bit. It was a two-stage question. I was thinking about the chronology of those packages of work that you tend to come across, and to help people to think about how to develop their work and take it forwards. Also thinking about, do you tend to go out for additional funding? Thinking about projects that you take on that are not yet in any way financially sustainable. Are you going out yourselves to get additional funding for those projects, and where might that be?
Yeah, I think the answer to that is both. I mean, I've used the phrase impact in mind. I just really encourage everyone to think about that. Again, the primacy of the research, it should always be sort of whatever, curiosity led. But I still think, having in mind how this might potentially be rolled out is always useful. It could be as simple as that. Again, we've had very small amounts of funding even to be on an advisory board or an advisory project group, just to sort of have some initial conversations. Obviously, we certainly do the initial conversations for free anyway, but in a few cases, small amounts of money being put in place just to have access to us to sort of steer them through that. Then there probably is early stage stuff where you might say, maybe at the end point of the stage one of the research, is there now a little bit of money from a impact acceleration thing to do a business plan, a financial model, develop some more materials. It could well be that part of what we do is to help source some of that non-research funding, whether that's charitable monies or through commissioners or talking to a local authority, saying, look, maybe this could be a pilot. Often it's easier to get money for a pilot project than it is to simply say, well, this is an all singing, all dancing ready intervention. So some places actually are paradoxically keen to fund a pilot project than they are to be, as it were, the first customer of an established intervention. So I think all those things are possible.
I didn't know, Paul, whether you wanted to mention Steph and her intervention in Edinburgh or Amol in Glasgow, just as examples of bits of projects that we've done where we haven't taken something wholesale to market. We've actually given them quite specific help.
Yeah. So again, I think these are both probably early career researchers who I think were probably likely to take their ventures out of the university, or maybe do it on a part-time basis and then have a part-time contract in the university. I think that was just more kind of advice. Probably in both cases we did some financial modeling, so they had a pretty good idea of how they would do things, because it was based on their research, and in some cases they were even generating further research from selling their services. But they needed help, cash flow forecasts and P&Ls, or some advice on the best way to set up a company. There's lots of pros and cons of different models, from a community interest company to a charity to a limited by guarantee or limited by shares. So I think in both cases they were able to identify some gaps that they had, and hopefully we were able to help them with that, even if actually they were going to be running their own interventions and building a team themselves over time.
I think as well, what was interesting about Amol was that he had already won some funding, from competitions, and we helped him with his application for another impact challenge, where I think he got through to the semi-finals or the finals. So also trying to identify within your university, or he was in Glasgow, within Scotland, what other pots of money are there that you could apply to, or that we could support you to apply to. I think we find all sorts of pots of money through having conversations that often people don't know exist within their own university. So I think that's been helpful. And just to your point, Lorna, on commissioning pathways, in public health, that's quite a specific thing. But also we had an academic who, quite interesting, had detected a smartwatch that he developed a smartwatch that detected relapse from smoking quitting. So if you'd given up smoking, this thing would determine that you were smoking when you were supposed to have given up. So he was had an initial chat with us really about how could that be used? How would he get it out there? It's just over a coffee type chat. And we were saying, well, it could be prescribed by a social prescriber for someone who's giving up smoking. It could be that Vitality Health, if you wear that, in the same way they'll give you an Apple Watch. If you do 10,000 steps a day, you get a reduced health premium. If you said you don't smoke and you wear this thing, then you will get a cheaper premium. Is it something you could buy off the shelf in Boots with the smoking cessation meds? They're all different pathways, I guess, to get your research commissioned or taken up, or your gadget. I just think it's like Paul said, lateral thinking is much easier from the outside than when you're in it and it's your baby.
So I don't know if there's any other questions, or whether we want to kind of conclude at that point. I mean, again, just to
sorry to interrupt, Paul. Tamsin has her hand up.
Brilliant.
Hi. This has been really fascinating. Thank you both for your time. Your earlier presentation conversations were also really fascinating, and so I'm very glad that I came on for the deep dive as well. I was wondering whether you could talk a little bit, just in a broad sense, about licensing. So I'm someone who's supporting researchers in terms of developing impact from their research, and I think we have a sense increasingly that other universities are using licenses in a more effective way than we are, and our approach at the institutional level has been much more traditional up till now, and primarily happening in the STEM disciplines, and so we don't really have frameworks set up in the teams that would usually be supporting licensing activity that are used to thinking about social enterprise or not-for-profit licenses. And I was just interested if you have any kind of thoughts about licensing as an approach for this kind of pathway, perhaps more specifically within universities. Any advice there?
Yeah, I think so. Certainly from our perspective, it's only a handful of things that we do, but where we have, obviously said before, we support universities in lots of different ways in some of the planning and the development, but where we actually are the licensor of direct IP from universities, we tend to like to have a license because it just gives a bit of protection for us. So for example, the intent thing, because we're now offering this on a cost recovery basis to local authorities on a 4-year basis, we clearly need to have an agreement with the University of Leeds that, well, obviously it's minimum of 4 years. In fact, it's an ongoing thing, because we wouldn't want something where potentially the university could pull the plug on us, with no notice. So there's a protection for us. So if we're going to put the time, and not just Evidence to Impact, but any organisation, any third party, we'll probably want that sort of protection and reassurance, which a licensing approach gives. On the other hand, I think it doesn't need to be complicated. So again, with intent, we listed 3 categories. First of all, whilst there's no, as it were, hard IP, there's no patents, there's no other stuff there, we were very glad that the university listed the publications, other things that went in to the know-how and the research, which is the IP of the University of Leeds. Secondly, because we had some funding from the university, out of which we partly developed the website, the logo, some of the training materials, the curriculum guide, the lesson plans, we listed that as joint IP between Evidence to Impact and the universities. We said, well, look, we partly funded it through our own time, but equally you partly funded it through some Impacts Accelerator money. Therefore, we regard that as joint IP. And actually, we also brought, as an organisation, we brought some IP. Actually, we actually had some license agreements already in place. We had some legal stuff we'd already gave, the quality assurance framework. So we listed that as our IP. So effectively, you had a kind of tripartite agreement between what the university has, what we developed together, and what we brought to the party. And then just some simple kind of milestones and the governance arrangement I told before about how we interact with the academics. The academic still feels that he has overall control. And that so far has been a really happy and effective way forward. And that's probably very, very different from probably quite complicated, licensing of your medical device to, Johnson & Johnson. So it certainly doesn't need to be that sort of level. Just because there's not sort of tangible hard IP, that doesn't mean you can't use a licensing approach for this kind of work. In fact, I think you can definitely do it.
I think as well, to add to that, we then create an operating license for the customers who use the intervention.
Yeah.
And that protects us and the customer and the university, and that's attached to the overarching license. And again, that's really simple, because we generally aren't dealing with solicitors in local authorities, we're dealing with public health commissioners. So that's not a big thing, but they like the comfort that that brings, and it makes it feel like a professional program, not just something that we're saying download it off a website. It gives us protection, and also the academics again know that we're really monitoring the know-how, the show-how, the IP, and that local authorities aren't going to start doing that program, you know, without doing it properly. So everyone's protected, really.
No, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Can I ask a quick follow-on question to that? So I just wonder whether you operate in this field, but I feel very much as though the concept of a license that isn't to be profit making is not necessarily that common. And certainly talking to you recently was the first time that I'd really come across that. Do you think there's an awareness of this way of working in multiple universities, or do you think it's still a growing field?
I think it's definitely a growing field, but actually I think I remember actually when I worked at the University of Bristol quite a few years ago, I was involved a bit more in the sort of high-tech, high-growth thing. Remember our vice chancellor at the time, he sort of said, because I think in some ways he's a bit skeptical about the agenda. He sort of said, well, actually, until actually it becomes a reliable budget line, i.e. the income we generate from royalties or license income, until that becomes a reliable budget line that I can rely on every single year, I treat it with a pinch of salt. You might make a few £100,000 one year, but then the next year you won't. So therefore he was actually ahead of his time in saying this is about impact, this is about reputation, this is about further research funding, not about the money you can make. And therefore I think even more so with social sciences, I don't see any reason why you may have an entirely royalty-free, no money changing hands license, but the license is still there to protect the reputation of the university, to ensure good governance, to ensure it's properly and faithfully adhered to. And that's a perfectly valid approach, because it's still, call it a license, call it a memorandum of understanding, call it a legal contract, whatever. The point is, it's clearly defined with a legal framework in place. Now, as I say, we've actually we pay a royalty to the University of Leeds. There won't be a huge amount of money, but it still felt appropriate to do so. Actually, with assist, the University of Bristol and Cardiff haven't got a royalty, and frankly, had they put one in place, they probably would have made potentially even hundreds, a six-figure sum from it. However, the amount of follow-on research they've got, as Sally mentioned, from the wider Decipher team at Cardiff, the Programme A, the Stash, or the assist work overseas. I mean, that's, well, I'm guessing probably in the millions. And actually, that's what you want looking for. It's the ability to grow research. I appreciate Bristol's a different university to some other universities, but the principle I think is still the same. And so I think it's not for me to say, but I think if you've got sort of contracts and tech transfer people, there's nothing wrong with putting in a royalty-free license if it ensures that impact is generated. But equally, they shouldn't give something away for free just because it's social science. I mean, if there's a plausible way for money to be generated, then they shouldn't be afraid to put in place an appropriate royalty. Does that answer your question, Lorna?
Sorry, I muted. Yes, it does. Thank you. We're at 2 minutes to 2. It may well be time to wrap up.
Yeah. So I just wanted to say, anyone watching on the recording or anybody still on the call, we're really happy to have some sort of one-to-one follow-ups, because often if it's actually talking about actual project or actual piece of research, often it's easier to sort of frame questions and conversations. We talk about your research rather than research in the abstract. So please feel free to contact. I think sorry, we got. I thought my details are on that, but certainly go through the website which is still on the screen, or
LinkedIn.
Give you
We've got a company page on LinkedIn and individual pages, so we're easy to find.
Yeah. So yeah, happy to do those follow-ups.
Just also, thank you very much, Sally and Paul. That was brilliant. Can I just put a poll up for those people who are on the call still? Launch poll. Here we go. And just, if you don't mind, just answering these questions. And I'm going to put some additional links into the chat of the podcast, the event series, and the YouTube channel for this this conversation and deep dive series as well. So I should put those in the chat right now. There we go. Brilliant. Fantastic. Thank you very much for finishing the poll. That's great. We are at 2 o'clock. Thanks so much, everybody, for joining the deep dive, and hopefully see you at the next conversation.